And as a result of that, what is going to happen here is that unemployment will rise more than it has to. And what is happening here, and I won't be a nerd here, but I will explain to you, what is happening here is what they call in economics, and I know it's very glazy over, it's called a liquidity trap, and it's very, very simple. It's a very easy way to explain this, right? In the boom, we borrowed huge amounts of money to buy stuff we don't really need, or didn't really need, and ultimately we've got to pay it back. You know, I remember during the boom, I was one of these few people who came out and said, this is all a load of, well, it's not really going to last, and I said this thing would be a disaster for the country and cause our banks to collapse. And what you have to suffer in Ireland, if you do that, and you'll find it when you get out of education and you go into the other world, it's kind of, it's going to go into the dark side or Narnia or whatever you want to call it, is that if you come out with new ideas, you get three responses in Ireland. The first response is ridicule. I remember going on prime time in 2004, not that I'll ever be invited back in prime time again, but there you go, and saying the housing market was a scam perpetrated by banks, builders and the government and foisted on the average person. And the response from the politician and the banker on the other side was to laugh. Let's laugh at the person. Laugh at the messenger who's saying something different. So the first response in Ireland is ridicule. The second response, when your ideas begin to gain a wee bit of traction, is violent opposition. Absolutely violent opposition. You know, your name is blackened in the press. You see this happening to George Lee, who's a friend of mine. You see it happen to him at the moment, right? George Lee has now gone and said the obvious, which politics doesn't work in Ireland. And all his former colleagues who 2 days ago, were his mates, are now ridiculing him. So the second phase is violent opposition. And the third phase in Ireland is very interesting. It's what I call the universal acceptance phase, where they say, Jesus, we all knew the houses were too expensive. And we all knew the bungalow down the road wasn't worth. Well, you didn't know. So what you have is three phases of ideas. And when you get out of college, if you do get into the game I'm in, which is, trading in ideas, and ideas can change the world. The only problem with Ireland now is not a failure of economics. It's a failure of imagination. And remember that. It's very easy to get out of the mess we're in. But if your imagination fails, or if your imagination isn't allowed to grow, or if you feel that the things you say, the things you do are not necessarily in the mainstream, well, then the economy will contract and the society won't learn from these mistakes. And once a society loses the imagination and the willingness to think and think differently, it can't prosper. And I believe we're in danger of going down that road at the moment, which is a wee shame. Because, what really has happened here is we spent far too much money buying houses, and now we've got to pay them. I remember, years ago, if you're on RTE or if you write books or do newspaper columns or whatever, you've got to, like I do, you've got a very strange relationship with Dublin taxi drivers, okay? It's a very unusual relationship, right? They either love you, in which case they all want to take you home, which is not necessarily the most pleasant experience, okay? Or they can't stand you. And they really can't stand you. And after about 2 seconds, if they're in the lovey camp, which is trying to give their daughters to you, which might be interesting, are in the Haiti camp. And about 3 years ago, I remember getting into a taxi in Dublin at the airport, and I took one look and I just knew, oh God, he's in the Haiti camp. Here we go, because you could just see him looking at me. And he was sitting there in his Dublin GAA jersey, stretched out over his bag. He's a bloke who thinks like blue bubble wrap is a good look, And I said to him, I got into the car and I just said, and obviously this annoyed him even more, and I said, Killiney, please. And you could just see him going, you stupid bastard. And I thought he was going to say, via a shallow grave in Finglas or something. But anyway, he said to me, he said, oh yeah, it's only yourself. I said, yeah, hi, how are you? And he said, oh, I'm absolutely smiling. He said, oh, where are you coming back from? I said, well, I'm coming back from London. And he goes, oh, London, yeah. He said, I'm after coming back from Kusadasi myself. I said, oh, not a fact. That's very nice, that Kusadasi. He said, I seen you on the television the other night. You're very articulate. You're very eloquent. You're quite good on television, you look good on camera. But you talk through your hole. And I said, well, how do I recover from this introduction? I said, and tell me more. And he goes, about houses and banks and things. The housing market's going up because all the Poles are coming here. I said, oh, right, the whole Poles. He said, yeah. I said, right. He said, I'm just after being in Kusadasi and I'm after buying 5 gaffs. Indeed, says I. And he said, a very nice man called Trevor Ewa, the AIB, is after financing them for me against the gaff in Lucan. I said, really? 5 gaffs? He said, yeah, absolutely lovely. He actually did say this, instead of saying creme de la creme, he said, it is a creme de menthe development, which I quite liked, actually. I thought, oh, that's an interesting one. And he said, golf course coming in 2029, that'll help you. And, and then his parting shot was, lovely people, them Greeks. I said, maybe Turks, you mean, but, I won't. Now, the point is, we've got to pay for all that stuff now. This is the problem. The problem is got to pay for a lot of the stuff that we actually borrowed, which we thought was very clever. And to pay for it all, we can do one or two things. One is we can pretend we have the money, which we don't. And the other is we can negotiate with the people who lent us the money because we don't have the money. And the reason we don't do the latter is because of a phenomenon, I think, which is, does anybody's granny ever here have a good room? My granny had a good room, right? It was so good that I wasn't good enough to go into it, okay? So her own flesh and blood weren't good enough to go into the good room, right? And what they did was my granny kept the good room for the local doctor, right? Or the local Fine Gael farmer or something like that, right? This is down in Cork, okay? And the whole thing in Ireland was that, like me and my cousins, when we were about 8 or 9, we were just, jeez, what goes on in the good room? Your mind would be racing, frankly. At that age when your imagination is very fertile and all that sort of stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, something very odd is going on here. But the good room was very simple. In the good room, my granny pretended that that's where we lived. And the local doctor pretended also that that's where we lived. Even though the local doctor knew we didn't live in the good room, that the good room was locked for 361 days a year, okay? And the key was hidden from the children. So what do we have in Ireland? We had this complete pretense that we pretended we were richer and posher than we were, and the really rich people pretended that we were telling the truth. But everyone knew it was a lie. And this is deep in our psyche, this idea of trying to pretend we're stronger than we are. And now the same thing comes when we're negotiating with the banks and all the apartments and Kusadasis and all those other things we've got to pay back that we don't have the money for. So we're pretending that your generation can pay for my generation. That's what this thing NAMA is all about. It's about raising taxes on you when you get jobs to pay for mistakes that I've made. So what it is doing is actually borrowing from tomorrow to pay for yesterday. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is at the core of our policy. And that's why you've got to figure out what you want to do in the world and not worry hugely about the political class, because they will not help you. It's a very strange thing to say, but I believe that this is a fundamental truth in Ireland. And the whole thing reminds me, and then you've got to say, well, how do you fit into the economy? When you leave, how do you fit in? What are you going to do that's going to make a difference to your life? So you take the education that you're getting and you use it productively in the economy to get a job, all that sort of stuff.